Hello, hello, hello. Happy Erev Purim. We're happy fast of Esther for those who are fasting. Not happy, right? Not happy. We're fasting. Perfectly timed fast because we'll starve ourselves all day and then ingest alcohol all night. It's a great combination. Okay, let's begin. Today's topic is, the title is Misogyny, Anti-Semitism, and Intersectionality in the Book of Esther. And if you read that topic and you saw the teacher, you probably thought, wow, Rabbi Kasher really drank the Kool-Aid at Ikar, right? Or did he steal that title from one of Rabbi Brause's sermons? It's not my usual it's Rabbi. It really feels like it does feel like a topic I took from Rabbi Brause, but I feel that intersectionality is a really important analytical framework for understanding the book of Esther. This term, intersectionality, has become popular in recent years in progressive circles. I think it was coined by a law professor, Kimberly Crenshaw, and originally, so the basic definition is it's an analytical framework for thinking about intersecting social identities. Like, we all carry multiple social identities, and I think when Crenshaw coined the term, she was thinking particularly about Black women. She is a Black woman. And the way that, for example, a Black woman might experience a certain kind of discrimination that's not necessarily entirely attributable to her being Black, not necessarily entirely attributable to her being a woman. Like, imagine a woman might get advance in a company and a Black man might advance in a company, but a Black woman, because of intersecting identities, has a different calculation that can't be explained through the prism of just one of her social identities. But then the term becomes expanded just to think about the way that all of our social identities might contribute to our experience of just either discrimination or empowerment, right? For example, I'm a white male Jew. So, some of those social identities are going to grant me access and power in the society, and at least one of them is going to make me more vulnerable in this society, right? So that sort of thinking is, I think, where the term intersectionality begins. It has come, I think, in recent years also to be a kind of a shorthand for a claim made in progressive political action that that different social identities, the holders of different social identities, ought to band together to fight against, our liberation is bound up together, to fight collectively against oppression, because we have to recognize the way that all of these oppressions are become, though it's not monolithic and it's not simplistic, and in fact, in many ways, the attempt to come together often produces its own complications and conflicts among social groups, and that is part of the dilemma, part of the problem. And I think part of what we're going to look at today is the way that that these identities in these groups can actually be pitted against one another, right? So that I think is the framework that I wanted to draw on today from the realm of critical race theory in the legal academy. And I'm sure, as I'm sure you are familiar. Some of you are familiar with it, the way it's seeped down now into our larger political conversation. Okay, let's say a blessing over our Torah study today. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so the book of Esther. the book of Esther is, we often think of primarily, and we probably ought to think of primarily in terms of anti-Semitism. And I say anti-Semitism not just as a catch-all phrase, but actually very pointedly, because the book of Esther is the first place where these people are actually really called Jews, Yehudim. And we know that because Mordechai ish Yehudi, Mordechai was a Yehudi, and that earlier in the Tanakh might have meant a member of the tribe of Judah, but he's not. He's a Benjamite. So he is a Jew, and the people now are referred to as the Yehudim, the Jews. Okay, so this is a story of an attack on the Jews, on the persecution of the Jews, and in fact, the kind of classic formulation in the book of Esther. Let's just take a look at it. This is it. This is where we go when we start thinking about anti-Semitism. It's just like the best expression of anti-Semitism in the Tanakh. Haman then said to King Ahasuerus, I'll give you the source sheet in a bit, but I just want to tee us up with this source. Haman then said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among all the other peoples among the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. And it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. If it please your majesty, let an edict be drawn for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the stewards for deposit in the royal treasury. Then the king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hamdata, the Agagite, the oppressor of the Jews. And the king said, the money and the people are yours to do with as you see fit. So just note there that the accusation is that there's these people, they're scattered around, and this is a word we'll pay attention to, datehem. The translation here is laws, it could mean customs, their ways, their religion is not the same as the king's laws, and it is not in your majesty's interest to ein shaveh la'anicham. It's not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. Okay, so that feels familiar, doesn't it? I mean, that sounds like a familiar character. They're scattered around and they got their own agenda, and it's just be careful, be suspicious. And just note here that the king doesn't care. The king is not, I'm not racist, right? The king is the least racist person in the world. The king doesn't care about Jews. It's just like the argument is made from someone else who has a personal vendetta against the Jews. There's a different part of the story. Haman has been outraged by Mordechai's unwillingness to bow before him. And Haman makes the argument, it's not a good idea to tolerate these people. It won't be in your interest because they got their own agenda. They're not going to obey you. And the king's like, all right, fine, go for it. Kill them all. Okay. So there we go. That's the beginning of our discussion in the book of Esther of anti-Semitism. But that's what the book is about largely, right? Like I've said this a few times over the last few days. It's like they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. That's the story of Purim. But there is the whole first chapter. First and second chapter, but the whole first chapter deals entirely with the oppression of women. Initially with one woman, and then very quickly expands to a consideration of the place of women in this society. And sometimes we're familiar with certain feminist readings of this chapter and of Vashti, who's sometimes been reclaimed, the queen who at the time who's been kind of reclaimed as a proto-feminist. We'll look at this story soon, but we sometimes sort of take this first chapter and just think about it through the lens of a feminist critique. So there's like the story of anti-Semitism, and then there's the other story about the oppression of women. But I want to think today about what this story, this initial story that deals with misogyny, has to do with the rest of the book? What is this doing here? And how does this impact our reading of the rest of the story? Because this is not just a device to get Esther in place. Right? It's not just like, well, you got to tell this story because that's how Esther became the queen. The book of Esther is incredibly well written. It is one of the most sophisticated literary products in the Tanakh. And so surely something about this story is meant to open up our understanding of the rest of the story. And it's not just as a foil or as a kind of like a prelude, but actually it becomes, it intersects, to use again that language, intersects obviously in the person of Esther herself, right? Who will carry these two identities, one of a woman in this society and one of a Jew in this society. Okay? All right, so let me give you a source sheet to work with, and we'll get started. All right, here we go. So putting a source sheet in the chat. Sorry, I didn't have this teed up earlier. Okay. All right. So now we're going to go into the first chapter here. Okay. And we're gonna move through some of the. We're just gonna get a feeling first for the setting that the Book of Esther very, I think, intentionally introduces us with. So there's this. We open in the middle of this opulent banquet at the king's palace in ancient Persia, King Ahasuerus, and it's quite a party. Royal wine was served in abundance as befits a king in golden beakers of varied designs, and the rule for drinking was no restrictions. Right? That's the rule. The rule for drinking, and the rule, by the way, is this same word, dat, the law, the rule, right? The rule for drinking is no restrictions. For the king had given orders to every palace steward to comply with each man's wishes. And as with our topic in mind, I can't help but note that kirtzon ish va'ish, according to the will of every single man. Okay. In addition, interestingly, now we're starting to get gender dynamics here. In addition, I'm going to try and highlight this because my mother keeps telling me it's helpful. Parker, you are unmuted. Could you mute yourself?
I'm looking at you. I don't need.
In addition, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for women in the royal palace of King Ahasuerus. Okay, now here's where things start to get ugly. On the seventh day, 7 days of partying, when the king was merry with wine, he ordered Mehuman, Bizeta, Harbona, Bigta, Abagta, Zetar, and Karkas, the 7 eunuchs in attendance on King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing a royal crown to display her beauty to the peoples and the officials, for she was a beautiful woman. Okay, so King Ahasuerus summons her to come from the women's banquet and show herself. Show her beauty, show her off, and the midrashim here are quite helpful. They're quite expansive here because this language of wearing a royal crown, the midrash takes to mean and nothing else. Wearing a royal crown mean, of course, she wore the royal crown. This was in order to have her come nude with a crown, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, conveyed by the eunuchs, and the king was greatly incensed, and his fury burned within him. V'chamato ba'arabo, right? That's very heavy language there. Okay, just to give you, I told you that some of the midrashim, the rabbinic commentaries, play around with, what's going on here, what's the atmosphere, and they imagine, wearing a crown but nothing else. This piece, I found this piece while I was preparing for this, and I had not seen it before. And this is just striking to me. Here's another rabbinic imagination of the scene. And it's just like, oh my gosh, this is just like, listen to this language. And to me, it feels so, this could be taken from some kind of modern conversation. One of them said, Median women are the hottest. And I say hottest here because that's like, it says na'ot, but it's just like, I want to give you a sense that this is like locker room talk, right? Like this is exactly this. I mean, I've heard this talk in locker rooms before, right? So the rabbis here also had their locker rooms. They knew that these are the kinds of conversations that happened, and they imagined. One of them said Median women are the hottest, and another one said Persian women are the hottest. Then the idiot, meaning the king, said to them, the vessel that this man uses is neither Median nor Persian, rather Chaldean, Kazdit. Do you all want to see her? Now, the language here, the vessel, the kli, almost like the receptacle that this man, do you all want to see her? They said to him, yes, but only if she is naked. He said to them, yes, and naked. Okay, so that's the vibe here, right? I think the rabbis are capturing rightly, whether they're being imaginative with the text or not. I think they're capturing rightly the spirit that we are meant to feel from this sort of drunken scene and this sort of summoning of the queen. Okay, but it's the next piece that we're going to think, I think, the most about today. The king is furious. He's angry. Okay, fine. And Vashti refused to come, and that is why she's been sort of reclaimed by modern feminists. Like, good for her. Okay, but the story doesn't end there. And it starts to get a lot more complicated. And here's where we really enter into the workings, the mechanisms of misogyny in this tale. Okay, so let's take a look. This is the part we're going to analyze together. Okay, then the king consulted the sages learned in procedure. Okay, for it was the royal practice to turn to all who were versed in law and precedent. His closest advisors were Karshena, Shetar, Admata, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, Memucan, 7 ministers of Persia and Media who had access to the royal presence and occupied the first place in the kingdom. Look at this language here. Those who knew the law or the custom or the way, right? And again, what shall be done according to the law to Queen Vashti for failing to obey the command of King Ahasuerus conveyed by the eunuchs. Interesting, by the way, as we think about gender, that the men who are going back and forth between the king and the women are men who have been castrated, right? So they serve an interesting role here too. Okay, then Memucan declared, in the presence of the king and the ministers, Queen Vashti has committed an offense not only against your majesty, but also against all the officials and against all the peoples in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will make all wives despise their husbands, as they reflect that King Ahasuerus himself ordered Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, he continues, the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will cite it to all your majesty's officials, and there will be no end of scorn and provocation, bizayon v'katzef. And no end of scorn and provocation. If it please your majesty, let a royal edict be issued by you, and let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media, again, same language there, date, that language, the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be abrogated, that Vashti shall never enter the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let your majesty bestow her royal state upon another who is more worthy than she. Then will the judgment executed by your majesty resound throughout the realm, vast though it is, and all wives will treat their husbands with respect, high and low alike. Pay attention to that phrase. Migadol v'ad katon, high and low alike. The proposal was approved by the king and the ministers, and the king did as Memucan proposed. Dispatches were sent to all the provinces of the king, to every province in its own script, and to every nation in its own language. Right? Going through, remember the Jews were called this people that was out there doing their thing, but there are lots of peoples in this realm. But they're sending this word to everybody, high and low, and to every people, every language, all of the different ethnicities that are in this society. And the message is liot kol ish sorer bebeito, that every man should wield authority in his home and speak the language of his own people. Sort of a strange addition there. Why speak the language of his own people? But importantly, every man wields authority in his own home. Okay. So let's try and figure this out. King Ahasuerus is upset. He just wants to know how to punish Vashti. But Memucan makes an argument, and he has a worry here. This is gonna spread, and it's gonna. What's his worry? Well, how does he think? How is this gonna work? What does Memucan think is going to happen now that Vashti has refused to appear naked? So the rabbis say before King Ahasuerus. What's the fear? Why suddenly jump to all? What's going on here, Maggie?
It seems like it's a revolt that they're trying to prevent from all of these feminist women of the time against their husbands.
Okay, that's right. There's some kind of, the women are going to, there's going to be an uprising. But what's the uprising? What are they going to, what do you imagine is going to happen? I mean, what are these women, they're not going to show respect? That was the only thing that, what do you think?
Well, a couple things. One, I think that this sort of quote-unquote uprising started by Vashti would demonstrate to the women of the kingdom that their queen has independence and can choose to do what she wants to do if it's beneficial to her. So then that could show to the wives and all daughters, the other women, that they can do the same. But one thing that's always puzzled me about this, wasn't Vashti like the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, so she could go back to her father, and then that could have created a lot more problems for Ahasuerus.
Right. That's an interesting sort of side story to think about. But I think you're right to suggest that Memucan is worried that Vashti has set an example here, an example of independence, an example of women not listening to their men, to their husbands, right? So it very quickly becomes not just about women, but about like the way women treat every woman in every house, the way every woman will treat her husband. But I don't know, this is the queen. And as you say, this is a queen that comes from very powerful lineage. Is that reasonable? I mean, what she gets to do what she wants. The queen is powerful. Like, what is Memucan right? In other words, like he may indeed be a misogynist, but is he correct that that's the way it works? That's the way it would spread? Yonatan.
Yes, I think he is correct. What you have here is power dynamics, and power dynamics change at the margins, both in terms of progressing them forward and when they regress backwards. When you have like an abusive spousal relationship, it's not like the abusive spouse will start beatings on day one, right? It's a progression, and this is fragility at work. There's a fear here that, you know, if she tests this boundary, if she asserts her humanity at the expense of her husband's power, then that's kind of a first step. There will be a next step, and suddenly we'll have to treat women as equals. And what kind of a world would that be?
It's amazing, isn't it? That it's mefurash. They say it like, oh my gosh! Like suddenly, it's almost like exactly what Yonatan said. We're gonna have to treat women as equals. I was like, oh, it's almost surprising how current in some ways it feels. It feels like just like it's right behind feminism, even though it's not. It's like hundreds and hundreds of years before, but there's some sense of like, at any moment, women could become equal to men. And then what would we do? Or forget about equal, but independent of, right? Sally.
I should learn to prepare to unmute. I also think we don't know the environment, right? So if they had seen some signs of women having jobs, working in inappropriate ways, if you'll forgive me, that would all, and it absolutely, and someone put in the notes about withholding sex. There's something about the fact that she has said no to something that is sexual that is relevant to the power dynamic that Jonathan spoke to.
I think that's very insightful, Sally. And let's keep an eye on that. It's not just that she defied him, and just to like give a little bit of, because remember, eventually Esther will be asked to defy the king, right? So, but this defiance was like, I won't submit to your sexual desire. And that, I think Sally's right. Sally's onto something. That was particularly threatening. That gets into the sort of the gender dynamics that exist in every single house. Okay, I'm going to continue to take comments, but I want, as I say, every single house to again highlight this very, very intentional language of sending it to every man, the rich and the poor of every single nation, right? What's going on there? How do you read that? Why is it important that every single man get this message? Not just the rich men, but the poor men too. Not just the Persians, but everybody's going to hear this message. What is it? What's all that sensitivity to the various kinds of men? Right? So I want to throw that question out there as well. Marlene. You don't have to answer that question. It's just like, it's now on the table.
No, I wanted to talk, and I think it relates to this. I wanted to talk about the last phrase, which has to do with only speaking the language of your home, because that's also a control thing for the women. If the men, maybe the men know more than one language and are commonly speaking more than one language as they're out and about, but all the people of the world are now being asked to only speak the language of your own people, which might also be saying restrict what the women can do and who the women can interact with when they're outside of the house.
Really interesting, really, really interesting. And we can think about even in our own, in the tradition of our own society, the way that women often spoke Yiddish, right? And not Hebrew, right? That was the language that of the men and of the scholars and of the sort of the public life. Yeah, very interesting. Kathy.
So I was going to say, it seems to me that this is very much, the argument is very much just, could be also seen as just a tactic of people in power. In other words, if they see just a sort of a small threat, whether or not that threat could eventually become something big, the thing is it's to the advantage of the powerful to then, go with it and say, oh my God, you make one concession to a worker in terms of workers' rights or whatever, and it's going to be full-blown socialism, and it's going to be this and it's going to be that. You know what I mean? That's a very typical tactic of making other people fear. I mean, clearly they had their own thing going on. I think this is not in contradiction to what people have said, but I also think it could be seen much more tactically that, okay, let's get everybody on board here. Let's say it's the worst thing in the world, and then we can fight this small change.
Okay, good. That's okay, great. That begins to point us towards the kind of connection that we're looking to make eventually today, right? That there's just a larger concern held by those in power, just that they want to keep their power at all costs. And any one group's revolution threatens the entire power structure, right? And remember, we've already heard that. We've already, in chapter 3, Haman is going to say, there's a group out there, right, let's look at it again, that does not obey the laws of the king. There's a group out there that does not obey the king's laws. It's not in your interest to tolerate them. Well, now this is just on the heels of the king dealing with someone else who did not obey his will, right? So there's like, you can see these sorts of, these struggles begin to have kind of like a parallel and intersecting relationship. Allison Goldman.
So I want to pick up on this thing that I think you're pointing to, which is the relationship between the political structure of what's happening and men and women. Like, why is he making this call to all men across class? Things like that. And there does seem to be this kind of trope that goes through political thinking that says that, like, the foundation of a society, like the structure of a society, is the family itself. Like that the family unit is this crucial building block for order on a more macro level as well. And in that traditional family structure, there is the idea that, you know, the men are meant to be in charge and the women are meant to listen. And that, like, foundational structure, I think, of like that there's like some force that's giving order and another force that's complying is sort of necessary on a macro level, maybe, to have a functioning state, right? Like you have to have like a military that obeys the leadership. And so maybe there is this suggestion that if you suddenly have women not complying, like at the highest level, that the king, the like most powerful force in the nation, like, can't control his wife, then how can he control the other men? Like maybe that the entire state might collapse.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating analysis you offer, Allison. I'm going to keep thinking about that, because it's a strange thing, actually, that a king and queen rule a country. Isn't there just one? I mean, right? We don't do that anymore. We have like the first lady, which is, you know, first gentleman. So that's a strange office anyway. But right, the king and queen rule. But like the king is really in charge. So what is the queen's job? And as Allison describes it, like the two of them have been modeling the family unit. They're the powerful. But then the queen's, the queen is the queen, but her job then is to model the submissive element of the family unit. Yeah, I think that's a fascinating analysis. All right, let's take one more thought from Marianka, and then we're going to move forward a little bit.
So I think that in the eyes of Ahasuerus, when Vashti said no to him, she uncovered his weakness. And then he goes, what? I'm weak? No, I'm going to make a law. I want to use my power that everyone is going to have to obey. Not just that one woman, but every man in the country, and every woman in the country, and every wife in the country. So it comes from his grab for power comes from the moment where he thinks his weakness is being demonstrated to everyone.
Yeah. I mean, there's something in your description, Marianka, that's there's something so personal about it, right? Which is true, right? The attack against the Jews starts because Haman is personally offended, and the attack against women starts because Ahasuerus is personally offended. Memucan is giving a kind of like a kind of sociology here of the way the upending of this power structure might take place. But there's also a way in which when as Marianka describes it, I'm thinking like there's a kind of retaliation. You woman, one woman have insulted me. I will take that out on all women. You, one Jew, have insulted me. I will take it out on all Jews. The personal becomes political, right? In a different use of that phrase. Okay, let's move a little bit forward. I want to continue to kind of give us a full sense of the heavy atmosphere of misogyny in the and in this case, particularly the objectification of women. We've already seen women being objectified in the Midrash with that very vivid language, this vessel which I use. But the Midrash is playing on some of the descriptions, I think, in this second chapter of the book of Esther, which describes then the search for a new queen. And you will not be surprised that it's a beauty pageant that is meant to summon this new queen. So, okay, sometime afterwards, when the anger of King Ahasuerus subsided, he thought of Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The king's servants who attended to him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for your majesty. Let your majesty appoint officers in every province of your realm to assemble all the beautiful young virgins at the fortress Shushan in the harem under the supervision of Hege, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women. Let them be provided with their cosmetics." No kidding, right? Like that Tamru Kehen. "And let the maiden who pleases your majesty be queen instead of Vashti." The proposal pleased the king and he acted upon it. When each girl's turn came to go to King Ahasuerus at the end of the 12 months treatment prescribed for women, for that was the period spent on beautifying them, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and women's cosmetics. I mean, a year of preparation. And it was after that that the girl would go to the king. Whatever she asked for would be given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. She would go in the evening and leave in the morning for a second harem in charge of Shaz, the king's eunuch, guardian of the concubines. She would not go again unless the king wanted her, and then she would be summoned by name. Okay, so that's the procedure for appointing a new queen there. Now, we know that Esther wins the contest, right? Esther is like the fairest in the land, and hooray. But I want to take a look now at some of the language that surrounds Esther's ascent to this position of power. The king loved Esther more than all the other women. She won his grace and favor more than all the virgins. So he set a royal diadem on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. The king gave a great banquet for all his officials and courtiers, the banquet of Esther. He proclaimed a remission of taxes for the provinces and distributed the gifts as befits a king. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai sat in the palace gate. But Esther still did not reveal her kindred or her people as Mordecai had instructed her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai's bidding as she had done under his training. Okay, so this is interesting. There's a beauty contest, and I don't know whether Mordecai sets Esther up, like pushes her into the contest, or whether women are just sort of being snatched across the land. I mean, part of what I want to think about is, do you think that these women did they want to become the queen? Like, are they, when we think about like beauty pageants, what is the mentality of these? Are they essentially slaves, or are they vying for something? Is the power desirable to them? And but more interestingly, what's Mordecai up to? Mordecai, who tells Esther, yeah, go for it, but don't tell them that you're Jewish. Right? Like, what is the strategy there? I guess I would like to know what would be the strategy of any woman in this contest, and then of course, particularly, what is Esther's / Mordecai's strategy here? Esther.
Yeah, I don't have.
That's okay. You have your hand up from before.
Oh yeah. No, I'm saying I don't have a direct answer to this question that you've asked, but I do wonder about what happens after the Purim story with Esther and Achashverosh. Like, I can't help but wonder, whatever happened with Vashti, like, did that dynamic repeat? And also what happened with Vashti and Achashverosh before the story began? Thinking again about like the relationships. And what's so interesting is, like, for a story that begins with a woman being disempowered, like the nahafohu, the kind of flip at the end is Esther has such a powerful impact. But she does so, I guess, in this maybe subversive way. She kind of like rolls with all the expectations placed on her of not rocking the boat. She does what Mordechai tells her to do. She does what, you know, she follows the rules of not to approach the king and only to do so in a certain way. And by the way, I don't know if we're going to explore this, but what does it mean that she, you know, the tip of his scepter, like, is there any like metaphor there? I don't know about any rabbinic commentary, but I can't imagine that there wouldn't be rabbinic commentary given what you've shown us today, which is really interesting. So yeah, I'm just, a part of me is kind of like proud of Esther, but maybe disturbed. Like, did she play by the rules? Did she kind of, she obeyed his, she kind of gave him power when it came to maybe the sexual aspects of the relationship. And then she kind of hid the things she needed to hide. And only once that was established, then, you know, it's like, you only get to be subversive when you've kind of given something up. I don't know. I don't have an answer.
No, I mean, you don't need to have an answer because that's very well put. I mean, that's one of the points of analysis here. It's like, how is Esther using, I mean, maybe through no choice of her own, but she becomes the hero of the story. She saves the Jews, and she does it by ascending to power. But she ascended to power through her beauty. And I don't know what wave of feminism is this? Like the second, third, like by using the trappings of femininity as constructed in this society, she gets to a place where she actually is able to wield power. But what has she had to sacrifice in the process? What has she had to accommodate herself to in the process? And remember, she's got her uncle Mordechai coaching her along the way. She seems to be obeying his orders. Right after we read a chapter where every woman was told to obey the orders of every man in the house, right?
And now that you've said it, I was going to say, is she really sacrificing? You know, that's a good question. Or was she owning it? Like, yeah, I like being beauty queen. You know, there's no way of knowing because we don't hear that.
Right, yeah. Right. Jen?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this passage and the last one is about building up complicity. It's about treating a population to participate in the oppression of others or to incentivize their own oppression. I'm mandating all the men to tell the women what to do. Plenty of men who weren't originally inclined to do that are gonna be like, well, it's the law. So we're doing that. I'm setting up a system of officials to be able to get women into this contest. Now there's a system throughout the land for getting women motivated to come and be oppressed by me. And whenever you set up, you sort of soften a population to participating in the oppression of others, it's very easy to transition that into oppressing a different group of people. So Mordechai is aware in a way that the story hasn't really mentioned yet, that the oppression of women is going to turn into the oppression of other groups as well, and that there's now a system in place for getting the entire population to participate in that.
Great. First of all, I'm fascinated by, I think it's a very incisive comment there, that there could have been men who are not interested in ruling in their own home, but now it's the law, they have to. So it's not just mandating the submission, but mandating the power. Right? Like, you now have to wield this power, right? Okay, and Jen continues kind of pointing us towards this connection that I want us now to as we head towards the end of this discussion, to start to think about, what does all this have to do with why is this the story we hear before we start to hear about the oppression of the Jews, right? So let's just begin to build that into the conversation. But I'll just keep calling on folks who have their hand up. I think did I see Lila out there? No? Okay.
I sort of, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yeah, I think all these things are connected in an interesting way. Sorry, my washing machine's going. Like, I've been thinking, as I've looked at this in the past, like, what enables Vashti to make this choice? And I think the systems and the structures that are in place are so key to this, because a party that goes 7 days gives Vashti a physical space. She and other women are separate from the men, and it's like something's been opened up. And what happens in that space? What kind of awakening can happen? And then you have you know, this question of what did the women want this, did they not? I don't know if Esther has any real, I don't think she knows what she wants. I don't think that's built into the story at all, because when Ahasuerus is not sophisticated, but all the people around him are. So do they need that much beautification? I mean, it's ridiculous. So it's like, if you get women, it's so intentional in a space for a whole year. I mean, that's a kind of brainwashing. So they're cut off from everything. They're cloistered, they're told, you know, very differently from Vashti and what might have happened freely in her space. And so do they want this? We can't, probably they have no idea what they want, you know? Anyway, that's.
Yeah, no, really fascinating to call out those gendered spaces, which are very prominent from the start. What is going on at Queen Vashti's banquet, right? And I never thought about this, Lila, but what's going on amongst this harem of women who are spending a year together in like a closed set, you know, as we would say here in Hollywood. Okay, I'm hearing some background noise. Anyone got? What am I hearing? Who's unmuted? Ah, great, thank you. Okay. No, still hearing some background noise. Jeff Zimmerman. No, it's not you. Oh, okay. Okay. I'm distracted. I'll just keep calling on folks. Bob.
Yeah. So you were asking how this sets up related to the oppression of the Jews, and I think what I'm struck by is regarding the misogyny is that the women can't hide. You know, and this is made very clear with Vashti, who's forced to appear naked. So there's no, there's nothing, I mean, she is what she is. She's a woman, and she represents all of the women who are being oppressed. But the Jews have a different option where they can hide, they can try to blend into society. And I think, you know, we eventually get to this in the story where Queen Esther, you know, she does keep her Jewishness hidden. And I think if I recall, you know, Mordecai, you know, eventually challenges her on this. So she has an interesting juxtaposition where, you know, there's part of what she's being oppressed for, being a woman, that she can't hide. And there's a part of her, of what she represents that's being oppressed that she can hide, which is the Jewishness. But ultimately, you know, she makes the decision that I think most oppressed people do, that, you know, ultimately hiding is not a solution.
Yeah, that is a very, very important factor to add into this. Which social identities can be concealed, right? I said before, I'm a white male Jew, right? But if I take this off, it's like I'm just a white male, right? Like which identities can be hidden, and as Bob says, not necessarily to the health or benefit of the concealer, but perhaps to the sort of strategic survival. And so Esther is being instructed here to conceal her Jewishness and to use her womanhood, and to use her womanhood in the ways that will advance her in this society, not to reveal her Jewishness, which presumably will not advance her in this society. Let's bring in this big moment that Bob was referencing, when she did not reveal her identity, but the big moment, the big sort of climax, the big transition point of the book of Esther is when Mordecai, and I've always been a little bit frustrated by this, because Mordecai is the person that told her to hide it, but then Mordecai almost like chastises her later on when he now decides she ought to reveal it, and says, do not imagine that you of all the Jews will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained your royal position for just such a crisis. Then Esther sent back this answer to Mordecai. And here, Lila was right. Esther has almost it feels like she has almost no volition in this story. But this is the moment where she starts to take control of her own identity. Here is an active decision. She says, go assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan and fast in my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. That's why some of us are fasting today. And I and my maidens will observe the same fast. Then I shall go to the king, though it is contrary to the law. There's that word that we've been following all along, asher lo kadat. Although it is contrary to the law, I'm going to do this. The kasher avadati, and if I perish, avadati, I will perish. Right? So something happens here, and I want to think about it both from Mordechai's perspective, like how is Mordechai using the identity to like get her in, and then suddenly to get her to advocate on behalf of the people, but also more importantly, what calculus is Esther making at this moment where she says, okay, now's the time, given what I have, the power that I have now, having ascended, using my role as a woman to ascend in that way, how do I now advocate on behalf of my other social identity? And what do you think of that calculus? Hannah Jensen?
Hi. Okay, so this is a new thing, this is the idea, I don't know, which is that maybe part of this thinking is that any woman who would be willing to be part of this beauty contest is seen as passing this unwritten, unspoken understanding of, you'll just do what I ask of you. The issue with Vashti was that she wasn't willing to do this theoretically feminine, correct role of a woman to the king thing. So she didn't do that. So any woman who's willing to jump through that hoop is likely not going to challenge the king anywhere else. Like that's the calculus that they're making, is any woman willing to be part of this is the kind of woman who's going to do whatever we want her to do. So Esther gets in that way because she's able to pass. And I think there's so much in the story about passing. And I loved what Jen said earlier, and thinking about how there's complicity involved, but also that she's passing as a woman, but she's passing as a certain kind of woman who trades on her beauty and doesn't have anything else to say. And so she gets in that way. And then she's also passing as a non-Jew because Mordechai has urged her to do that. And then it seems to me like at some point she feels like, I am too complicit in all of this. I'm too complicit as a woman who doesn't say anything other than whatever the king wants, and I just care about my beauty. And I'm too complicit as someone who's Jewish and pretending that I'm not. And it's no longer right or fair or just for me to be in these halls of power and not be advocating for people who aren't. And how do I actually use my privilege and leverage it, not just for my own well-being and not just for my own access, but for the sake of betterment for other people and groups. And I think a lot of us who have intersectional identities, many of which are not visible, often end up passing, and we're able to get access to these spaces that other people aren't. But then what do we do with that? And at some point, I think she can't sit with the discomfort of having that kind of power without being honest about it.
Janet.
I was thinking, if we use a phrase from Pesach, you know, in each generation, there's some woman who stands up and says, it needs to be different or needs to be better. But to lift up what Hannah was just saying, you know, maybe she went in and felt more comfortable in her first role. And as she gained her confidence, then she took on her next role. So first she went in quietly as a woman, and then she decided to speak out as a Jew. And so what's so instructive about this is to see how this plays out even currently in each generation. So if you think about how Kamala Harris handled Mike Pence while he was interrupting her, and she smiled nicely and she said, "Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking." In another generation, a woman politician might have said, "Don't interrupt me." And, you know, we can think of each generation of female politicians as just an example of how they've learned from the previous generation. So I think in a little nutshell that's what Esther did. She learned each role and she mastered it, and then used that information to benefit each group going forward.
I'm gonna keep calling on people. I just want to get as many voices in here as possible. Wendy Becker.
So I want to take it a little further, and I was coming to be in a little different direction, similar. We talk about hiddenness, and Esther, the name of Esther is to hide, hiding. And I think that's a huge part of this story and why it's so important. God is not mentioned once in this at all. And yet this story is so important to us. And we're seeing in this how women need to hide parts of maybe how they are feeling inside and do whatever it takes to get their point across, to do what needs to be done. And I think that there's a message here that also God is hidden. We don't necessarily see God in physical ways, certainly not what transpired in Torah before, the splitting of the Red Sea, all these miracles. But that hiddenness, there's a power in that as well. And that even what may be hidden from ourselves inside, there is something there to be reckoned with and that we can utilize in our lives to help save us through prayer. And that's the other part of it. How Esther really, says, pray for 3 days. And that power that she musters up, not from something that's seen, but from something that is prayed, is so powerful that force also helps in how this story goes.
Thanks for that. That's right. Esther means the hidden one, right? Or I will hide myself. And these last several comments have all been dealing with that factor, right? That Bob first introduced, that there are certain identities that we can conceal. And Esther is very actively negotiating that. And then Hannah adds to that Esther is concealing a part of her womanhood, right? She, by playing one kind of woman, yes, she's visible as a woman, but she's concealing another part of her womanhood in order to leverage the aspect which will gain her power, but which will keep her safe as well, right? Esther is a hero. Esther saved her people, but it's complicated, isn't it? I mean, this book doesn't resolve these questions very, very neatly or nicely. Like, she's had to make some difficult decisions to get to a place. And let's just remember, we started with the story of a woman who defied the king and was deposed for it, right? The story hinges on another woman who defies the king, and it turns out okay, I guess. But how did she use her power? How did she defy him? And here I want to just return to a comment that Sally made early on. Right? What was the nature of Vashti's defiance? It was, I will not be sexualized and objectified. Right? Esther's asking for something else. And remember, something that the king doesn't really care about. Oh, it turns out I'm Jewish. Will that be okay? It's a risk, but it turns out, yeah, sure. Sure, as long as you're my pretty wife, right, then that's fine. And I just want to add to this something that we sometimes gloss over, that I think is very much to Sally's point, which is that it isn't just that Esther asks for the Jews to be saved, but that afterwards, when the king comes to the palace garden, to the banquet room, Haman was laying prostrate on the couch on which Esther reclined, because Haman had remained to plead with Queen Esther for his life. Does he mean, cried the king, to ravish the queen in my own palace? No sooner did these words leave the king's lips than Haman's face was covered. Then Harbonah, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, what is more, a stake standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, the man whose word saved the king. Impale him on it, the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the stake which he had put up for Mordecai, and the king's fury abated. So yeah, Esther leveraged her power in very complicated ways, but also part of the problem is that King Ahasuerus was angry because his woman had been taken sexually from him, right? That's part of why Haman is ultimately defeated. So it's like there are like all of the old power dynamics are still in place, And they continue to be in place at the end of the story when we read that the Jews take revenge on their enemies and go out slaughtering people throughout the land. So they certainly have not taken the message that, wow, we have been, the message of Exodus, we have been oppressed, so we should be thoughtful and careful to others who might be oppressed, right? Those lessons have not been learned by the book of Exodus, by the book of Esther. The book of Esther leaves us in a bit of a mess with like all of these groups sort of carefully moving through the power structure to hopefully survive. And as Janet said, you know, there are generations in which that's just the best you can do, is kind of leverage the systems of power so that hopefully you can claim as much of your selfhood as possible. So hopefully we're in a different generation than we were in the book of Esther, but we still, as Janet said, we still have generations to go before we escape these systems of power, which don't they feel all too familiar to us when we read these ancient texts. So may we get there soon. Wishing you a good day, an easy fast, and please join us tonight for our Purim celebration, which I think is just going to be it's going to be funny and fun and a good time. Bring a bottle to the screen and let's party. Okay. Nice learning with you all together. Thanks for your Torah.